somewhat lengthy narrative. I want to just read it through together, and then we're going to break it down. So we'll just take it from the top right here. This is chapter 37, verse 1, where it says that Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, succeeded Jehoiakim, son of Jehoiakim, as king of Judah. And he was appointed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. But neither King Zedekiah nor his attendants nor the people who were left in Jerusalem listened to what the Lord said through the prophet Jeremiah. But King Zedekiah sent for Jeremiah, asking, "Please pray to the Lord our God for us." And so Jeremiah had not yet been imprisoned, so he could come and go among the people as he pleased. That's sort of the introduction. And you just see right from the very beginning what bizarre picture is being painted for us. And so you've got the Babylonian king appointing a Jewish king in Jerusalem. So that means that by this time, Judah and its capital Jerusalem had become a vassal state for the much more powerful Babylonians. And it says that in terms of the spiritual condition in verse 2, that neither the king, Zedekiah, nor the officials that surrounded him, nor any of the people who were still in Jerusalem listened to what God had to say through his prophet, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, Zedekiah is asking in verse 3 for Jeremiah to go and please pray to the Lord for us. And so you just see this incredibly divided heart from the get-go. I don't really want to hear what God has to say, but it sure would comfort me to know that you're praying for me. Well, we read on. In verse 5, at this time, the army of Pharaoh, Hophra of Egypt, appeared at the southwestern border of Judah. And when the Babylonian army heard about it, they withdrew their siege of Jerusalem. So here for years, Babylon has laid Jerusalem under siege. And that means that they are basically trying to starve out the people who live there, and they're doing a very good job of it. And they are constantly trying to break the walls down, so they have to be mended and attended to at all times. But now the Egyptians, sometime after, several years after their destruction at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC by the same Babylonian army, are really beginning to flex their muscles again, and they want to engage Babylon in battle. And so that was coming as pretty good news for the people in Jerusalem, because it meant the withdrawal of these Babylonian siege forces. But then it says in verse 6 that the Lord gave Jeremiah a message, which is this. This is what the Lord, the king of Israel, says. The king of Judah sent you to ask me what is to happen. Tell him Pharaoh's army is about to return to Egypt, though he came here to help you. The Babylonians will come back to capture this city and burn it to the ground. Not good news. This is what the Lord says. Do not fool yourselves into thinking that the Babylonians are gone. They aren't. They're coming back. Even if you were to destroy their entire army, leaving only a handful of wounded survivors, they would still stagger from their tents and burn this city to the ground. That's commitment, my friends. We read on, when the Babylonian army left Jerusalem to face Pharaoh's approaching army, Jeremiah started to leave the city for the territory of Benjamin to claim his share of his family's property. Okay, so everyone has left Judah, the land of Judah, and Benjamin, which is like right beside it. And so Jeremiah is taking this moment to go out and settle accounts and make sure that he has legal rights to ancestral property that really belonged to him. And it says in verse 13, as he was walking through the Benjamin gate that's in Jerusalem, a sentry arrested him and said, "You're defecting to the Babylonians." The sentry's name was Zedekiah, son of Shelmiah, just in case you were wondering, grandson of Hananiah. Glad we got that right. "That's not true," Jeremiah protested. I had no intention of doing any such thing. But Zedekiah took Jeremiah before the officials. They were furious with Jeremiah and flogged him and imprisoned him in a cell for many days. Verse 17, later then, King Zedekiah secretly requested that Jeremiah come to the palace where the king asked him, "Do you have any message from the Lord?" "Yes," Jeremiah said. "You will be destroyed by the king of Babylon." How's that? Then Jeremiah asked the king, "What crime have I committed? What have I done against you, your attendants, or the people that I should be imprisoned like this? Where are your prophets now who told you the king of Babylon would not attack you or this land? Listen, my lord, the king, I beg you, do not send me back to the dungeon, for I will die there." So Zedekiah commanded that Jeremiah not be returned to the dungeon, and instead he was imprisoned in the courtyard of the guard in the royal palace. That's an upgrade to minimum security, I guess. The king commanded that Jeremiah be given a loaf of fresh bread every day as long as there was any left in the city, and so Jeremiah was put in the palace prison. Chapter 38. Shephatiah and Pashur, officials of Zedekiah, heard what Jeremiah had been telling the people. He had been saying, "This is what the Lord says. Everyone who stays in Jerusalem will die from war, famine, or disease. But those who surrender to the Babylonians will live." That's exactly what Jeremiah was saying. The Lord also says the city of Jerusalem will certainly be handed over to the army of the king of Babylon, who will capture it. So these officials went to the king and said, "Sir, this man must die. That kind of talk will undermine the morale of the few fighting men we have left, as well as that of the people. This man is a traitor." King Zedekiah agreed. "All right," he said, "do as you like. I can't stop you anyway." So the officials took Jeremiah from his cell and lowered him by ropes into an empty cistern in the prison yard. There was no water in the cistern, but there was a thick layer of mud into which Jeremiah sunk. Okay, a cistern larger than this room that we are in, once full of water that was so necessary to survive the siege month after month, year after year in this arid climate. But now it's really bad news. That cistern has exhausted its supply. All that's left is a bunch of mud, and they've had to they just lower Jeremiah into this place, getting him out of the way so that he would die. But, verse 7, Abed-Melech, the Ethiopian, an important court official, heard that Jeremiah was in the cistern. At that time, the king was holding court at the Benjamin gate, and so Ebed-Melech rushed from the palace to speak with him. "My lord the king," he said, "these men have done a very evil thing in putting Jeremiah into the cistern. He will soon die of hunger, for almost all the bread in the city is gone." So the king told Ebed-Melech, "Take 30 of my men with you and pull Jeremiah out of the cistern before he dies." So Ebed-Melech took the men with him and went to a room in the palace beneath the treasury, where he found some old rags and discarded clothes. He carried these to the cistern and lowered them to Jeremiah on a rope, and Ebed-Melech called Jeremiah, "Put these rags under your armpits and to protect you from the ropes." And so when he was ready, they pulled him out, but Jeremiah remained in the palace prison. One day, King Zedekiah sent for Jeremiah and had him brought to the third entrance of the temple. "I want to ask you something," the king said, "and don't try to hide the truth." Jeremiah, by this time a little cynical, says, "If I tell you the truth, you'll kill me. And if I give you advice, you won't listen to me anyway." So King Zedekiah secretly promised, "As surely as the Lord our Creator lives, I will not kill you or hand you over to the men who want you dead." Then Jeremiah said to Zedekiah, "This is what the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, says. If you surrender to the Babylonians, you and your city and family will live, and the city will not be torn down. But if you refuse to surrender, you will not escape. This city will be handed over to the Babylonians, and they will burn it to the ground." "But I'm afraid to surrender," the king said, "for the Babylonians may hand me over to the Judeans who have defected to them. Who knows what they'll do to me?" And Jeremiah replied, "You won't be handed over to them if you choose to obey the Lord. Your life will be spared and all will go well for you. But if you refuse to surrender, this is what the Lord has revealed to me. All the women left in your palace will be brought out and given to the officers of the Babylonian army. Then the women will taunt you, singing, 'What fine friends you have! They have betrayed and misled you.' Then your feet sank into the mud, and they left you to your fate. All your wives and children will be led out to the Babylonians, and you will not escape. You will be seized by the king of Babylon, and the city will be burnt to the ground." Then Zedekiah said to Jeremiah, "Don't tell anyone you told me this, or you will die. My officials may hear that I spoke to you. They may say, tell us what you and the king were talking about. If you don't tell us, we'll kill you. If this happens, just tell them you begged me not to send you back to the dungeon to die there." And sure enough, it wasn't long before the king's officials came to Jeremiah and asked him why the king had called for him. But Jeremiah followed the king's instructions, and they left without finding out the truth. No one had overheard the conversation between Jeremiah and the king, and Jeremiah remained a prisoner in the courtyard of the guard until the day Jerusalem was captured. This is a crazy narrative. And it is all about the insanity of the enormous pressure that is being experienced by everyone in the city. For years, they have been under siege. For years, they have been scraping for just enough food to continue to live until the next day. They are trusting in all kinds of things that they are trying to rely on to give them hope and comfort in this incredible moment, which by all description seems all but inevitable, that the city, like every other city in the region, is going to fall to the Babylonians. And so here we have then, within that reality, a couple of very different perspectives. And it's really all about the subject of courage. I want to talk a little bit about that. First, with respect to Zedekiah, is kind of the antithesis to what courage is. And then to Jeremiah and his buddy, Ebed-Melech, who provide a different picture of what courage looks like under these terrible circumstances. And then think together about what does that mean for us? What can we glean from this that would help us live in a victorious and effective way in our day? So that's where we're going with the story. Let's begin with Zedekiah. Zedekiah, first, obviously cannot take a stand. He just is this chameleon-like figure who just adopts and absorbs whatever opinion of the people that are around him. But the chameleon will ultimately come to a place where there is a circumstance in which it's going to be either A or B, and there is no middle ground. And so it is either Egypt is going to save us, as the officials were saying, and as some of these false prophets were around in Jerusalem at this time were also saying, see, the Egyptians, they're going to come and they're going to defeat the Babylonians and we'll be saved. So there's that's one narrative. And then there's Jeremiah's story, which is to surrender the Babylonians because God has released you from his protection because of your disobedience, and he is going to allow the natural course of history to take its effect, and this city will be destroyed. So you need to make decisions about how you're going to deal with the circumstances that you're facing based upon what narrative you trust. And it's clear that Zedekiah, on the one hand, was not prepared in any way to do what God called for him to do. And at the same time was in this terrible place where he knew Jeremiah was speaking truth from God. And so he's confronted on the one hand with something that is false, but comforting, and another thing that is true, but not comforting. You see the problem here? And what this reveals is something inward about Zedekiah that I think is important for us to think about a little bit with the help of an old friend named C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote a book years ago called The Abolition of Man, in which he brings together the biblical call to live before God and the insights from the great Greek philosopher Plato. And in this, he talks about matters of the conscience. And he talks about conviction, and that this is the thing when we are under pressure and when the die is cast and when there's a lot to be worried about. It's really this inward part of who we are that helps us get clarity and defines for us what do we do in a situation and the effect that that situation has on our soul. Lewis puts it like this. He says, the head rules the belly through the chest. Okay, let me explain what he's talking about here. The head is the intellect. It's how we think. It's the brain operating. You're grinding out information, you're reasoning, so forth, right? The belly, in Greco-Roman thought, that's the seat of the emotions. And, it's just how you feel is what the belly is all about. It's the visceral person that he's describing here. And you've got these two things going on inside of human beings. You've got a rational side and a deeply emotional side, a feeling side. And he says that the head rules the body, but through, he says, the chest. And the chest, again, in Greco-Roman thinking, was the seat of the soul and of convictions, of conscience, and for us to be whole people and in harmony with who we are, the head, the belly, the chest, all need to be reading off the same page. That's what he's saying. The head rules the belly through the chest. The seat of emotions, organized by trained habit into stable sentiments, are indispensable liaison officers between cerebral man, thinking man, and visceral man, feeling man. It may even be said that it is by this middle element that man is man. For by his intellect he is mere spirit, and by appetite mere animal. And so it's a really interesting picture, I think, of what it means to be whole. And the biblical view of humanity is holistic. We're not merely a mind embodied in flesh. It's not what we are. We are a composite of all things. There is intellect, yes, that's right. There is feeling, true enough. And then there is also this element of moral awareness, of conscience, the place where we develop convictions, not about what we would like to do, but what we ought to do. You see that? And the Bible describes humanity in the image of God as a bringing together of all of these things. And when one of them is out of whack, it puts the whole thing out of whack. And the point that Plato was making, which is the point that Jeremiah is making in this passage, it seems to me, and which C.S. Lewis is bringing us today in the contemporary era, is the distinction between what Plato called the democratic man and democratic society. What he meant by that was that it is easy to be a person who says, okay, in a democracy, all voices count, right? But the democratic man doesn't say it's just a matter of all voices count. It's that they're saying, well, all voices are true to the person who utters them. They have, in essence, their own truth, their own reality. And that Plato saw this with clarity, interestingly, in the 4th century BC, and recognized that this is the single greatest threat to democracy. People not ruled by conviction, but having a democratic mindset that says, whatever you believe is what's true for you. What a pluralistic society means is that everything is true, which of course at the same time means nothing is true, right? And so this is the dilemma that seems to be the case in a world in which we lack fundamentally solid, defensible, intellectually convictions that can drive or harness our emotional life so that we can act victoriously and effectively. I think that nothing could be more valuable for us to reflect on today as a society than this very ancient word that comes to us both from the Bible and from the rational tradition of the Greeks. Because the voices in our culture are calling us to say that, whatever is true and whatever you want to believe is awesome, embrace it, it's true for you. Even if the person right next to you believes something that is completely the opposite. And so what happens then is that we just end up in a circumstance in which we just try to manage one another and not be offended by or affected by the freedom of the other to invent their own narrative and their own realities. That's the postmodern world we live in. And we should not be surprised by that at all, because it is rooted in a diminishing of the very notion that there are such things as stable moral truths, values, things about you that make you valuable no matter who you are or where you came from, that are true for everyone. And in the absence of that, what we're left with then is a view of using the levers of society for empowerment. In the absence of truth, power must fill the vacuum. And this is what was happening in ancient Jerusalem. It was that Jeremiah was speaking the truth about what God was saying in this moment at this time to his people. It was not well received. It wasn't what people wanted to hear. So they're creating their own stories. And instead of being able to sit down and say, okay, well, on what basis are you making these claims? There is no common ground. And so they're just basically appealing to power, and that's why Jeremiah finds himself in prison. A democratic society requires that people have true convictions, that we are able to argue it out together. Respectfully, yes, respectfully. But at the same time, clearly, it's people of conscience who have something objective to hang their ideas and their beliefs on, that enable us to move forward as a society. And so there's just something, I think, again, from the standpoint of just how we understand our society, something very important in what's going on here at this last moment, this last gasp of Jerusalem's history. We also see that Zedekiah, not only lacking in conviction, but is totally a people pleaser. He's basically just able to schmooze whoever is in his face. Whoever he's around, he's going to agree with them. If he's in front of Jeremiah, he agrees with them. If he's in front of his officers, he agrees with them that Jeremiah ought to die. A people pleaser, which is ironic as the king. In any event, I really like what Ed Welsh says in his really helpful little book called When People Are Big and God is Small. He says it like this. He says, we fear people because they can expose and humiliate us. We fear people because they can reject, ridicule, or despise us. We fear people because they can attack, oppress, or threaten us. You think so? I think so. He goes on, these three reasons have one thing in common. They see people as bigger, that is, more powerful and significant than God. And out of the fear that creates in us, we give other people the power and the right to tell us what to feel, think, and do. I just think that's just exactly right. I think there is that thing within us that we don't want to ruffle feathers. We don't want to cause discomfort and disagreement. And so we want to tell people what they want to hear. Why? Well, not for their good at all, but rather because it's just easier for us. And so many of us, as Welsh points out, and which experience, I think, overwhelmingly attests, live our lives in this people-pleasing, fearful way. And we see this all over Zedekiah. He is neurotically moving from one opinion to another. The effect of people-pleasing on the inner life is that you can't hold a conviction. Because if someone challenges that conviction and you're committed to making peace with them at any price, you've got to backpedal. You've got to change your point of view. You've got to adopt a different perspective. And think about how that makes that sense of anxiety when what really is important is what people are saying to you or about you, how people think about you. That's where a lot of our anxiety in life is coming from. We are living in the shadow of the opinions of other people, whether they're our parents or our employer or a love interest or whatever it may be. And this is a significant problem that we experience, all of us experience in one way or another. And so I think it's important for us to be able to explore a little bit of our inner world, as Welsh invites us to do in this short but very effective book. Just to ask ourselves, what is it that seems to control my inner life more than God himself? Is it the tokens of success that are dangled out before me in my professional life? Maybe it's the attaboys that I get from my performance as an athlete or whatever it is. I think all of us recognize that our emotional lives aren't created in a vacuum, right? And that some of the things that help us kind of orient ourselves to reality and cause us to feel the things that we do are really good things. Some of them are really broken things. A lot of us have grown up in environments that were just super unhealthy. And so even as adults today, we still feel like we're out of sync within ourselves. And yes, the idea that I'm riddled with anxiety or unresolved anger or many of the things that seem to really dominate the thinking and the behavior of so many of us really can be traced back to things that have elevated themselves in our own minds to a status greater than what God has to say for us. And I just think that Zedekiah exemplifies this more than anyone. On the one hand, he doesn't want to hear from God. On the other hand, he pleads with Jeremiah to pray to God for him. It's not that he wants to do the right thing. It's not that he wants to follow God. He just wants that sense of being scrutinized by God off his back. And what a terrible place to be then, because now I am the one who is in charge. I become the only and final source of authority about what's true, what's right, how I should feel, and so forth. And so Zedekiah cannot take a stand because he is lacking in conviction and because it is people-pleasing rather than God-pleasing that is at the center of his scheme in life. On the other hand, we look at Jeremiah, his buddy Ebed-Melech from this narrative, and we see a different perspective, a courage of conviction. That's right, where Zedekiah has no apparent conviction and just basically is able to believe and repeat whatever the person in front of him has to say. Jeremiah is not that way at all. That he has had his inner life has been trained by truth. And so to go back to C.S. Lewis, it's his head that has been instructing his chest, his convictions, so that his inner life, his feeling states are in line with what is true and not some broken effect of an untrue and shattered view of what is actually reality. And that is at the heart of what it means then to grow in integrity, to grow in our ability to withstand even the deep pressures that life is going to bear upon us. Willing to wrestle with his tendencies to accept untruths. That's right. You know, Jeremiah was confronted by a lot of untruths. He was accused by his own family of being a false prophet. He was persecuted by everyone and felt the sense of incredible unfairness that, as we studied several weeks ago, early in our study of Jeremiah, he takes to God with his complaints, his laments, and opens his heart to say, God, this just isn't fair. Where are you, God? But he doesn't stop there. He wrestles with this very question that he's asking. And he seeks God. And he's able to hear from God what he needs to hear. Not to fully make sense out of the moment that he's in, but to know he who is with him in that moment. You see the difference? He's not able to understand the whole of why he's being opposed in this way. Who can understand the evil in the heart of man, right? But we can understand that God is invested. He has not abandoned us. He's with us. And so what he calls us to is for our good and for his glory. And Jeremiah, over the 40-some years that precede this event that we're describing here this evening, is trained by this process of lament where he 5 times in this great prophetic book brings his concerns, his complaints, his questions, his position before God, and then works it through. Are you willing to work through your doubts? You have doubts. If you're a thinking human being in a world like this, you've got doubts. That's all right. But it's not all right to surrender to your doubts. You fight through with them as Jeremiah did. You seek the mind of God in that moment of darkness that you are in. And over a period of time, Jeremiah developed the habit of being able to hear from God, that his inner life, his chest, was trained by the truth that he knew. We must be ones who tell ourselves the truth, even when that truth is out of sync with how I feel in the moment. Because at the end of the day, what are we going to trust? And what is going to shape and mold that innermost part of who we are? So that's a very consequential issue going on here. Jeremiah prepared to act on conscience despite his fears, despite the discomfort, despite the insecurities. He's volitionally placing himself in danger every time he opens his mouth. Every time he speaks, somebody wants to kill him, right? But if you have the convictions that God has placed upon him and the word of truth that God had for that moment in time, for those people, what else can you do? As we'll talk about in some detail next week, Jeremiah says, if I do not speak, my bones are on fire, and I cannot quench it. I have to speak. That, my friends, is the voice of conviction. We need to be voices of conviction, not rude, not unloving or ungracious, but we need to have clarity of mind to speak to the broken lives of the person across the street, across the city, and across the world. It matters how we as the people of God engage the dilemmas that we face as a society, as a world. A Tale of Three Africans. I was just thinking about this as I was kind of praying through this point. And it just occurs to me that over the 10 years that I've been working with partners who are really, at this point, dear and trusted brothers and enormously effective Christian workers, I've noted that Lou Kasa in Ethiopia, Vinton in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Victor and his team in the Ivory Coast, all three of them experienced something very significant, which is that all of them were brought to a point in their pursuit of God and their service of Him, all of them, where they had to decide, will I press on with what I know to be true, or will I cave to the demands of the people around me? When Lou Kasa in Ethiopia was 19 years old, he was expelled from the Orthodox Church, kicked out of his family home, lost his job, as did everyone who was in the Bible study that he taught. A group of teenagers, people as young as 12 years old, all expelled from their families, from their communities, and so forth, come together, and they formed a church, and that church grew into the hundreds because they were willing to obey the voice of God against the judgment of their culture and even their families. A revolution of love that bound them together and kept them communicating graciously but clearly the love and grace of God to the very people who were putting them out of their houses, out of their community. Similarly, with Vinton's experience, with Victor's experience, thrown out of the church that he was a part of because he could not accept the false teaching that had emerged in that church and the pain that brought to him, but enabled him to start afresh and seek the mind of God. And that is just, I think, an important part of what does it mean to really be that person with the catalytic impact in the world that God has placed you and me into. What are those things that are pressing down on us and that force us to ask, what does it mean to be a person of conscience in this neighborhood, in this family, in this community, with the people that God has brought into my life? To maybe say things that are hard to hear, perhaps, but needed in the moment, words that would heal if heard and heeded. And Jeremiah was this kind of person. Are you increasingly this kind of person? The scriptures call us to speak the truth to one another in love, to be a truth teller, that our ability as a community to mature and to develop is rooted in the conviction that God places on each of us to play that truth-telling role to one another, to see our angle on another brother or sister and to be able to say encouraging and challenging things that might enable them to see with renewed clarity what it is that God is calling to them to do in this moment, at this time, for them. Do you see what I'm saying? That is the person that Jeremiah and Ebed-Melech were. We've talked in weeks past about this notion of persevering, of persistence, that is a part of the cultivating of of these convictions. Hashkim. It's the idea of just that consistent day in, day out, or as one person put it, a long obedience in the same direction. It's such a true thing. It's just striking to me that such a statement would come from the most notorious atheist of the 1800s, Friedrich Nietzsche. But in any event, what he says is true. As we walk ourselves down that path of following Christ, of allowing the truth to inform our conscience so that how we feel is in alignment with what is true and what is truly valuable, that enables us over time to leave in our wake the effect of being lights and salt in a world that sees that example and says, there's something here. There's something of substance. And that is the kind of person that God has called us to be as persons of conviction. Now, Zedekiah, because he cannot take a stand, because he has no convictions, because he is a people pleaser, it lives, therefore, in fear of people. That fear manifests itself in terrific dishonesty. You see in this narrative, it's pretty interesting. 3 times there's this idea of secret. Did you pick that up as we were reading that through? He's saying out loud, yeah, Jeremiah's bad news. Yeah, you should kill him or whatever. But then secretly he wants to talk to him. And that's what it is. He's fearing the voice of those who oppose him, at the same time knowing that he needs to hear from him. So in chapter 37, verse 17, 38, 16, 38, 24, again, just that repeated idea that Zedekiah has this private conversation going on because he knows, as much as he hates what he's hearing, he can trust what he's hearing because he knows that it's true. And because Jeremiah is willing to put his money where his mouth is. So, a fearful person is an isolated person as well. Boy, it just seems to me that nothing could be more characteristic of the day that we live in now as isolated. We are not just COVID-19 isolated, although that has made things way worse. But we also have kind of adopted a way of living, of working where we are isolated. That in social media, we are more comfortable and more able to speak than perhaps we would in person. And that also is, kind of a warning sign, kind of a on your dashboard when you realize I'm willing to shoot out this fiery email in all caps and all this kind of stuff to this person and say things I would never say to their face. I think there's a word for that. What's it called? Huh? Coward. Oh, well, yeah, there is that. Sure. Well, let's move on. On the other hand, what Jeremiah shows is not a fearing of others, but a fearing God in an appropriate sense, a living in an awe of God. The idea that God's opinion is really the opinion at the end of the day that matters. As Os Guinness put it so many years ago, it is the audience of one that we should concern ourselves with. He writes in his book, The Call, I live before an audience of one. Before others, I have nothing to gain, nothing to lose, and nothing to prove. I like that very much. He's not saying, I don't care what people think. Of course you care. It matters what people think in the sense that we're called to be communicators to people about the love of God, right? So it matters what people think, but at the end of the day, I don't base my life. What's most important to me is really, what does God have to say? And we need to be able to answer this question with clarity. What does the audience of one have to say about you? Oh yeah, you. All that stuff that you've been about here recently. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? Yes, you do. It helps to have this terrible, raspy voice to make this point. I promise that the tenor of our discussion will change radically next week after a course of Zithromax. Here's what Paul says. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and stand he will, for the Lord is able to make him stand. You know, you got your ups and downs, the moments that you're not proud of and the moments that you think you did okay. You're like this. You're like an EKG wave, sine wave or something like that, right? But there's a steady and a constant that runs through that, and that is the opinion of God. And in God's mind, if you are in Christ, you're new in him. You are his child in whom he delights. And that, at the end of the day, is the only thing that matters. Any other foundation will place you at a terrible deficit within your own soul, because it will establish a bar that you cannot reach, and even if you could reach it, you shouldn't. And so here, I think we stand on this ground that says it's true, like Jeremiah, everyone seemed to be opposed to Jeremiah, but the Lord God Almighty, and it's his voice that we need to hear and heed. We want to add as well that heeding that voice and living before that audience of one actually helps us move towards other people. This isn't some sort of a super spiritual, just me and God, we've got our thing. It doesn't matter what you think or where you're at or what you're doing or whatever. Not at all. In fact, what we find instead is that as we really live before this audience of one, where we really anchor our soul in what God has to say about us, then that frees us in relationships, not to be takers of people on whose opinion our ego and our sense of self-worth depends, but rather so that we can roll up our sleeves, confident in who we are in Christ, to serve them and their good and their interest. And such a person is not alone in this world. People are drawn to people like that. If you read through Jeremiah, you recognize, interestingly, I think, that there are 60 people mentioned in Jeremiah's prophecy by name. The overwhelming majority of them hate him and want him dead. But there are many others who are on his side and who would call him their friend. And I think that that's really an important thing for us to understand here. That if we are living before an audience of one, that enables us to appropriately entrust our lives to another person. Appropriately entrust our lives to another person. Because if we're not looking to like a locust, suck the life out of them and then move on to the next soon-to-be carcass, but rather are full of the love and care of God for us, then we will find true community. And that is a beautiful thing. I've been thinking about this, as well as a thought that the writer Eugene Peterson put in my head a while back on this subject. And he says something that truly resonates, I think, with Jeremiah's situation and kind of reflects mine as well. He says, one evidence of Jeremiah's wholeness was his capacity to receive friendship, to let others help him, to be accessible to mercy. And then here's the thing that just kind of struck me as I don't want to hear about it, but it's true nonetheless. It is easier to extend friendship to others than to receive it ourselves. In giving friendship, we share strength, but in receiving it, we show weakness. 3 weeks ago, I guess it was, the time is slipping away along with whatever brain cells I have left. Linda and I came home from a long trip to Moldova to visit our team over there. Tired after 20 sleepless hours of travel, 7:30 in the evening, ready to come home and put our feet up and get that relaxed feel. Instead, we opened the door to the effects of 15,000 gallons of water that had coursed its way through our house in our absence. So we don't live in our house right now, and we won't for a while. But it made me think about this. We're living with our daughter and son-in-law. We're soon to live with some friends of ours in Dublin, and after that, some other friends, and we got that kind of going on. But both me and Linda have been like, we have, over the course of our marriage, lived with about 27 people. We've shared our home for a matter of weeks and sometimes years with a lot of people. We're not afraid of communal living. But we've always been on the come stay with us end of that. And it's just a lot easier, I'm telling you. Because it is, like he says, coming from that place of strength. I've got something to offer. Not that place of need, like I'm now basically, in a upper middle class sense, homeless. So there's some stress there, and it's showing weakness that neither one of us want to be able to see. And because why? Because with our children, we want to project strength, right? We're parents, not can I please stay in your spare room couple, that. And so it's been kind of an interesting moment, I guess, for us at the end of the day to think about this facet of, if we really are fearing God, if we're living before Him, the nature of our friendship really has to be truly reciprocal in nature, not one-sided, not what's comfortable for me, but rather what the need of the moment requires. So think about that. Zedekiah, self-protecting, scheming. He's always got a plan. He's got these secret meetings with Jeremiah, and he's talking to his counselors, and one plan after another. At the end of the day, however, his plans, because they weren't God's plans, ended in disaster for him. As we read in the next chapter, the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes in Riblah. That king of Babylon also slew all the nobles of Judah, these very people who were saying trust in Egypt. He then blinded Zedekiah's eyes, bound him in fetters of bronze to bring him to Babylon. This story ends badly for Zedekiah, as it does when we're operating out of fear based upon our feelings rather than really becoming courageous people of conscience, which informs how we interact with the stresses of life that face us. Instead, we find with Jeremiah and with Ebed-Melech that they are prepared to suffer. They're ready for this. They take risks. Think about Ebed-Melech. It's interesting. It says that he was an Ethiopian. His name was Ebed-Melech. You know what? That's not his name. That's his title. It means servant of the king. Here's a guy important to the story who isn't even dignified with being given a name. Just a function. He's a nobody, even though he's in the king's court because the king needs him. Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, an important court official, heard Jeremiah was in the cistern, and at the time the king was holding the court at the gate, the Benjamin gate, he went and rushed into the place. The thing about what's going on is very public. He's out before the gate of the city, where people are coming to argue their case and they want to be heard. And so here comes Ebed-Melech running through the crowd saying, "Hey, my lord the king, what these men have done is a very evil thing." So he is really exposing himself in that moment to all of the anger of the crowds that have rejected Jeremiah and everyone else. He's taking risks. Courage is forged when we have to take risks, when we have to say the hard thing that needs to be said, when we have to do the hard thing that needs to be done, when we have to apologize for that thing that we did with humility and not meeting in the middle, but saying, "I'm so sorry," whatever it is, and to lay ourselves open to whatever the response is going to be. Both of our heroes in this narrative show great courage in the risks that they are willing to take, and paradoxically, their ending is different from Zedekiah's because they find life. They're cared for by God at the end of the story, and they walk away with a piece of wisdom that could not be learned in any other way, the wisdom that Jesus passed on to his disciples when he said, "Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it." And so there we are on the subject of courage.